Bitcoin's energy dynamics, why it consumes so much energy, and what we can expect from it in the future. So Bitcoin is this global, neutral monetary network. It provides the settlement of value in an apolitical sense, without regard for who is using the network, and it transacts tens of billions of dollars a day and stores the wealth of hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars. And it's used by, we don't know exactly, but 50 to 100 million people worldwide. Let's just reset and remind ourselves why Bitcoin consumes any energy at all. So there's really a number of reasons, but there's two primary ones. So the first one has to do with providing settlement assurances, effectively providing to users of the system the assurance that their transaction will settle, will have finality, and will have a single linear history of events in the Bitcoin system. And so the miners incur this cost to create new blocks for the privilege of adding transactions to blocks. And in exchange for that, they get compensated with new units of Bitcoin and fees. And so this energy cost incurred by miners encourages them to behave honestly and to pursue a single linear history of the network, as opposed to branching it into other directions or creating these reorganizations where they change the history of the network. At peak, Bitcoin will process $10 to $20 billion a day in final settlements, and it stores around $600 billion today, although of course that changes on a day-to-day basis. So it's providing a genuine monetary transactional utility in a way that's quite distinct from other transactional systems. Additionally, and this is often overlooked, Bitcoin mining is a system of distributing the new units of Bitcoin to the world at large. When Satoshi devised Bitcoin in 2008 and then created it in 2009, Satoshi had this conundrum: how am I going to actually distribute the units of this commodity to the world at large? The method that Satoshi settled on was proof of work, where effectively you have to spend energy and computational resources in order to obtain new units of Bitcoin. So proof of work solves this decentralized initial issuance problem. Now, a lot of people say, well, why can't we just strip the proof of work out of Bitcoin and insert a system like proof of stake? Well, if you were to do that in proof of stake, you would create influence proportional to the number of coins held. In the case of Bitcoin, that would make these large custodians, banks, effectively, that control lots of coins on behalf of users. It would make them the stewards of the network. It would give them effective control. And unfortunately, it's the case today that large fraction of all the outstanding Bitcoins are controlled by these custodians. And so if you were to eliminate the proof of work process and impose something like proof of stake, or delegate control to these third-party validators with a lot of influence, you would lose the NIC assurances. You would lose the decentralization of the network effectively. As far as we know, proof of work provides pretty unique assurances that aren't recaptured by any alternative system. As I mentioned before, proof of work has a couple different functions. One of them is to mediate the initial issuance of new Bitcoins. And it's interestingly the fact that historically, the vast majority of Bitcoin's energy expenditure derives from this issuance. So miners are compensated in two ways. One is through the collection of new units of Bitcoin, and then the second is through fees that users attach to transactions. But historically, the issuance of new units of Bitcoin has dominated their revenue. It's been over 90% of their revenue historically, with transaction fees being much more minor. And so when you think about the energy consumption of the Bitcoin system, this is really critical because you have to decompose transactional intensity from miner revenue and hence energy spend. It's not the case that adding more transactions will dramatically increase the energy expenditure of the Bitcoin network, as a lot of people mistakenly believe. Most of the energy consumption is really a function of the price of Bitcoin and, of course, the value of that new issuance that miners are collecting. That's really what's going to drive the energy consumption over the next few years, not the number of transactions. Bitcoin can scale up the number of transactions or the value of transactions without really having a linear proportional effect on the amount of energy that miners are consuming. You shouldn't think of Bitcoin's energy dynamics as analogous to something like Visa. You should think of it as similar to gold, where the vast majority of the energy expended by gold production, manufacturing, extraction, has to do with mining the gold, pulling it out of the ground and refining it. It has much less to do with moving the gold on trucks or boats or anything like that. It's kind of similar with Bitcoin. Most of the energy outlay in Bitcoin's case is a function of the initial creation of Bitcoins. And so that's a key thing to remember, because gold is this useful commodity that people use to store their wealth outside the confines of the state. The extraction of gold is kind of tolerated, even if it's not particularly ecological. And same thing with Bitcoin. The production of Bitcoin is, still, yields and provides us with a system which is of value to society. But, based on the kind of state-of-the-art knowledge we have today, Bitcoin miners consume about 1/4% of all the world's electricity and about 1/10% of all the world's energy production, because the world produces a lot more energy than it does mere electricity. And so that's kind of where we are. And whether you think that's really high or really low has to do with your view of sort of the merits of Bitcoin, whether it's a worthwhile thing or not. But our best guess is that Bitcoin is responsible for around 50 megatons of CO2 emissions per year, or around 0.1% of the world's emissions. Now, what does this actually mean? I mean, what does this compare to? So you can compare it to individual small countries, as is very commonly done, or you can understand that the world is this sort of highly globalized place, and that for the most part we outsource our industrial capacity to one or two major countries, which account for the vast majority of sort of energy production and consumption. So Bitcoin's current energy usage is around 0.7% of China's energy production and between 1% to 2% of America's. Bitcoin's energy footprint is 12 times smaller than always-on devices in US households. It's 15 times less than electricity lost in transit globally every year, and is slightly less than the amount of energy consumed just by domestic tumble dryers globally. And of course, a tumble dryer is a discretionary thing. You can always dry your clothes on the line if you want, but it improves our quality of life. So we accept the fact that it consumes some energy. Bitcoin compares favorably with the energy used by copper mining, zinc mining, gold mining. Those all, as far as we can tell, have a greater energy impact. We don't often think that critically about the energy requirements of those industries, because they brought us into modernity. I mean, they represent the trappings of civilization. Air conditioning meant that we could live in hotter places and just live more comfortably. So we don't regret the energy that's used on them, the same way that we shouldn't regret the energy used for this novel monetary transmission technology. Is leading to a more accountable, more known, more identifiable, and more sustainable body of miners. And so, of course, it's still early days, and we don't have a complete informational picture regarding the sustainability of the Bitcoin network. But the trends look extremely positive. And at the end of the day, this is an industry that provides a significant value and utility to tens of millions of people worldwide. And so I think the prospects for Bitcoin mining are bright.